I wanted to look at really firm location, firm concentration, and factors that affect firm entry and survival into clusters in Pakistan really, and we had the data for Punjab. One of the things which I noticed when I was thinking about competitiveness is there's really no consensus on competitiveness. And when you go down to the firm level, you sort of start thinking about, okay, if you have data on, costs of inputs and output and, all of this sort of stuff, you can try to figure out, how firms gain a competitive advantage in an industry. The problem is, very rarely do we have that sort of data. And the second issue is that now competitiveness has now moved on from just, okay, you produce something at a lower cost. There are a lot of other issues in terms of quality of goods produced, human resource endowments, technical factors like R&D and innovation. All of these issues make competitiveness a lot more complicated. So, so what I did was I cheated a little bit. I combined my interest in competitiveness with my interest in firm level behavior, and I really said, in a very crude sense, a firm really is competitive domestically and internationally, if first of all they can enter a market, and then secondly if they can survive an industry. So that's what I really wanted to look at in this paper, was look at firm entry and firm survival and the scale of the operation of entrance into these export sectors. Let me just say very quickly that this is primarily, comes from the research a lot of very bright graduate students are doing, using a very unique data set which we had gotten from the Industries Department, Government Punjab firm level data. So they've done a lot more interesting stuff, but I'm just looking at the export firms. Just to sort of tell you very simply what I want to do, and Dr. Irfan has given me very strict instructions that, 20 minutes or he's going to cut me off. So I'll go through this quickly, and I won't spend too much time looking at my econometric results. One of the things I wanted to look at was see how local conditions affected firm entry and firm survival and scale of operations. And, and I wanted to see if you already have firms of that industry in a particular geographical area, is it easy to enter into that area as a new firm? Secondly, does it increase the chances of survival? Or is it better to go to another area, where there are not other firms, you're not competing against them? The second thing is, I wanted to also look at this idea of if there are more firms generally, not just of your industry, does that have spillover effects? Can you gain in terms of labor? Can you gain in terms of inputs? Can you gain in terms of, other factors, obviously scale of production factors? I wanted to look at some of those things. That's the domestic issues. The international issues I looked at, and this fits in very well with the last discussion, was trying to look at how real exchange rates and tariffs affect firm entry and firm survival and scale of new entrants. Sorry, I think, I didn't go back too much. Yes, I did that, sorry. So, first of all, I thought this is really interesting. I'll start by showing you some of the maps we made. Very few people have made maps. I think Burki, Ams has done some stuff. But I wanted to show you what these clusters look like, and they're very interesting. Second is, and I won't spend, actually I've spent almost no time on the literature on entry and survival, just to give you some basic ideas. Then I'll show some models, and then more interestingly, I'll show you the results of those models and discuss the conclusions. So here is an interesting cluster. We have textile industry, processed goods. As you can see over here, how to do the pointer? There it is. As you can see over here, heavy clustering over here in all of these industries, which are the export industries. I mean, this is not very heavy, but you're going to see it in the next few, which is there are clusters, but interestingly enough, there are not just clusters in one area in terms of in these industries. As you can see in the textile industries, finished material, which means this has important implications for industrial policy. And I think industrial policy is a word that people don't use anymore. But I think, especially if you're going to be relying on the private sector, as the discussions this morning showed, for investment and for growth opportunities and development, we are going to be really focusing on these industrial policy issues. So as you can see over here there are actually multiple clusters. The second thing I want you to notice is some of these white spots, and these are not all the firms we have data on. There are a lot of firms, but there's so many firms that one of these little spots, one what represents many firms. The yellow ones show new entrants. So as you can see over here, that not only is there clustering in these particular areas, But new firms are entering into these clusters, right? And they're not going outside. So obviously this makes economic sense. You're going to go into an area where there are already existing clusters, but not a lot of people have looked at it for the exporting industries in Pakistan. Now, this is just some data we had put together in terms of firm entry, and firm entry is generally very low in these export industries. As you can see over here, right, the definitions and all of the data I've given in the paper, but generally speaking that there's very low, and in the textile sector, which is a major export sector, there are very low the entries. But firm survivals are high, right? Which means that these firms are generally competitive both domestically and what call it internationally. Now, I'm not going into the nitty-gritty in terms of costs and as Sakandar pointed out in terms of the quality of the goods produced, but it's interesting that firm survival is significantly high in all of these sectors. Now, this is interesting, which not too many people look at, is the scale of entry. We're looking at scale because of limitations of data in terms of the number of employees, the labor in these. And they're what call it entrance in the textile and cement sectors, what call it hire the most labor. So these are the new entrants, and on average, these are the sectors that hire, as you can, oh, sorry, I pushed the wrong button. Could you go back to one more? Yes, as you can see over here, here we go. As you can see over here, these industries are the ones supplying the most labor when they're entering, new firms enter in. Again, you can see, this is an interesting, this is the Herfindahl index. I'm not going to go too much into mathematics, but they show the levels of concentration of these firms in these export sectors. And you can see that there are generally, interestingly enough, low levels of concentration when you're measuring concentration in terms of the number of workers. I won't spend too much time on the literature review because of the time limitations, but one thing you may want to look, I did want to point out is, I'm going to be looking at two interesting factors again, which not a lot of people have looked at. The effect of localization, i.e., how many firms of your specific industry are operating in your area and how that affects firm entry and survival. And secondly, urbanization, factors of the area in which you're actually operating in, all of the other industries. Also socioeconomic characteristics we look at. Also, we wanted to look at the effect of international shocks on firm entry and exit. And in particular, the two things we're going to be looking at is the exchange rate, which fits in well into the real exchange rate, which fits in well into what the last speaker talked about, and also tariffs. And you can see how tariffs affect entry and exit at scale for these new entrants in these exports. Now, what we basically had to figure out how to do it, so we looked at the major importers of Pakistani exports, and we were focusing on the EU and the US, so we were going to be looking at the tariffs of those. So this is, again, I promise not to spend too much time, but this is the sort of thing we're going to be estimating for entry. And as you can see over here, we're looking at entry as a function of exchange rates, tariffs, and some firm control variables. We do the same thing for survival, which is, we measure survival on how many firms stay in this industry. And we're also going to look at it as a function of real exchange rates and control variables and tariffs. The second part about our paper is looking at local conditions, and we're going to look at arrival as a function of localization and urbanization, which is, as I discussed, and scale of operations, same thing. So let me get into the results, right? I think it would be useful because of time limitations to skip this and just get into the discussion. These are summarizing the tables. One is, interestingly enough, more firms in these export sectors are entering these export sectors in less competitive industries. And if I have time, I'll discuss some of the implications of that at the end. Secondly, the new entrants do not necessarily have to be large. Right? The big idea that you need to have a large investment to be entered into these, and you have to be large scale. That does not hold. Right? I'm sorry, could you go back on my push the wrong button again? Firm survival is unaffected by the degree of competition, interestingly enough. And this is interesting, and I think a lot of people would like to see this, and this goes well with this, is that firms, entry and survival significantly increases as a result of depreciation in the real exchange rate. Interestingly, it's omitted here, it was on the last slide, the tariffs did not affect firm entry and firm survival and the scale of operation. That may be also because the data did not show a significant amount of variation in these tariffs in the time periods we're looking at, but still, it's an interesting result that it's really the exchange rate that's affecting them. And now this is the one in terms of the impact of local conditions. It's a little bit tricky, some of these things, because we're looking at localization and urbanization at an aggregate level, and then we're going to break it down into this, what we call it at small scale, medium scale, and large scale. What we mean by something like this, like let's say urbanization at the small scale, really means how is firm entry and firm survival affected by the number of other small scale firms, or number of other medium scale firms, or another other large scale firms, what we call it, of all industries in your particular geographical area. Right, and this is, let me just get to the results here, right. What you can see over here is that new firms are taking advantage of the presence of other firms in their sector, right. This makes sense, obviously, right. All the ideas you can think about in terms of benefits of clusters, labor pooling, input sharing, knowledge spillovers, etc. So this is a nice result, right. Now this is something a little bit different, which is, right, firms really benefit from having small and large scale. And interestingly enough, the number for small scale is higher, which means that new entrants are really what call it tempted to go into areas, into industries where there are a large number of small scale manufacturers in that area. Also large scale. The large scale idea we think is really driven by the fact that if you have a large number of large scale manufacturers, a lot of those who live, or a lot of those people who work for those firms will then leave and open up their own companies, which is a nice result, but this is not very high. The big number really is the existence of small firms in their sector. Similarly, right, new firms are also benefiting from what were medium-sized manufacturers in general. Right? Again, there are significant spillovers. If you open up in an area, not just where they're producing soccer balls, or just where they're producing surgical coats or textiles, just generally where this production is going on, right? This benefits in terms of tempts people to enter. Now, this is interesting, and I'm going to discuss this, but this fits in well with our discussion in the morning of what we had in terms of cities, right? Which is, interestingly enough, it's saying, let's not go to other cities and start to tempt people to enter into these markets. These cities already exist, right? Now, and I'll just discuss that in a bit, right? Now, this is one more thing, which is firm entry is hindered by the number of new entrants, by having more large firms in general, right? Now, this is nice, which is, if you have a lot of large firms, right, in your area, there are instances in certain sectors in which entry is limited, I think, entry barriers, which makes sense. Let me skip this because of time constraints. I think, I've jumped into a conclusion. There were a few other things which I'll even mention right now is, we looked at a lot of socio-economic characteristics and how they affected firm entry, firm survival, and scale of operations. Right? And we found a lot of them were not significant. Now, some of the stuff we think should be significant, like the average education of the people in that area by looking at survey data, that was not significant. We would think that, you have a more educated workforce, you'd be more tempted to open up there. The thing that really picked up a lot of influence was, if you had a higher average income in that area, there was a lot greater chance of having firm entrants, having firms survive, and having larger firms open up in that area, as in these export sectors, which really may mean that these firms may be hiring people and willing to train them themselves, but the high income may be reflecting the relaxation of constraints, especially financial constraints these firms may have. The higher the income, the less you may have to go and try to seek outside financing, and the greater the chance you may actually be able to open up the firm yourself. So a lot of socio-economic characteristics you think should be relevant, and they discussed in my paper, are not relevant in terms of affecting firm entry and firm survival. This is some of the things I wanted to point out, which is optimal location, right, is in the existing clusters, right? There is an obvious temptation for us to say, look, we want to develop certain areas, we want to have higher growth in these areas. There's not a lot of industrial activity going there. Let's go there. Let's set up something new. This seems to be saying that, that really entrants prefer to go into areas where there are already existing industries. Not a great idea in terms of, doesn't help us a lot in terms of development, but it does have a very strong implication for industrial policy. The second thing is, right, but not in areas there is already a significant number of large industries. Large industries tend to stop entrance, and that's an important point to make, which is fine, it's okay. Large industries tend to stop entrance, right, because of the obvious barriers. There is, so I discussed this, right, which is the higher income areas suit new entrants, as I discussed. This is a result which, reiterates what a lot of people have said, but it's been done, one of the rare times it's been done using Pakistani data at the micro level, the firm level data, is how depreciations in the currency really spur new entrants into these export sectors, right? And also the other fact of the matter is how the tariff barriers or changes in the tariffs of the our major recipients of our imports does not affect firm entry, firm scale, and firm survival, right? And this is something I'll end really with this point, which is there is a great temptation to try to open up to stimulate growth in new areas, right? Idea of new cities and try to develop these new cities, but in a sense, right, unless we're thinking about new industries, if we want to actually expand our present industries, really is, right, the old locations are far better, right? So I'll stop there. I think that's finished up exactly in 20 minutes.
Right.